She was starving, broken, and forgotten by the world. But when a poor woman gave her last piece of bread to a dying boy, she had no idea. She was feeding the heir of a hunted Sioux bloodline. What happened next changed the entire frontier. The prairie wind howled like a wounded spirit through the broken rafters of a crumbling homestead. Outside, the sky threatened snow, even though it was late spring. The earth had cracked open from months without rain, and now the frost came early, as if the land itself wanted to swallow what little remained. In a shack stitched together with rusted tin and warped wood, a woman barely past 30 knelt beside. A cold stove, her fingers blue from cold and hunger, cradled a crust of hard bread wrapped in a cloth that once served as her mother's apron. Her name was Martha. 2 winters ago, she had buried her husband beneath a cottonwood tree, the wooden cross long since blown sideways by storm winds. A year later, a fever took her son. What remained was silence endless, echoing silence punctuated only by the sounds of wind, creaking wood, and the growling of her own stomach. The bread in her hand was the last of it, her last act of defiance against the cruel hand of fate. That morning, she had dug into the soil behind her house, desperate to plant seeds she no longer possessed. The attempt had been futile, the ground frozen, but she didn't stop. What else was there to do? Her only neighbor, Old Man Harkness, had vanished weeks ago, and the trail to town had grown dangerous with bandits and wild dogs. She had not seen a soul in 13 days until now. Out beyond the barn, half collapsed under the weight of snow, something moved. She'd first mistaken it for a fox, but when the shape staggered forward, then fell, she knew it was human, thin, ragged, and so caked in dust that he might have been born of the earth itself. A boy, maybe 10 or 11, lay, face down near the fence. No hat, no shoes. His feet were cracked, bleeding. She hesitated only a moment before rushing out. Her legs nearly gave out beneath her. Hunger had stripped her muscles, and the cold bit at her knees. But she stumbled to the boy's side, flipped him over, and saw not just a child, but something older in his eyes. His face was sun-darkened, and around his neck, tucked beneath. His filthy shirt was a braided leather cord with a carved buffalo tooth. It meant nothing to her yet. He didn't speak. He didn't move. His lips were dry, cracked open like the land. Martha carried him inside not because she had strength, but because she had purpose again. She laid him on her cot, pulled the only blanket over him, and stared at him for a long time. He was still breathing, shallow and slow, and then she looked at the bread. There wasn't enough to split, not really. But she went to the stove, lit the last stub of candle wax to warm the pan, and softened the crust just enough. She gave the larger portion to the boy. For a moment, her stomach roared like thunder in protest. But as she watched the child's jaw work slowly, weakly, she felt something shift. Outside, the snow began to fall not flurries, but sharp, thick flakes. Like ash drifting from a funeral pyre, Martha sat by the boy through the night, unable to sleep. She pressed a wet cloth to his forehead. She listened to the wind scream and wondered if she'd just given away her last chance at life. But something in the boy's face, maybe the strength of his jaw, the weariness in his eyes, reminded her of her son. And something unspoken passed between them. Not in words, in survival, in silence, in bread. The next morning, his fever broke. His eyes opened fully, dark and alert. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But he looked around the room, at the food she no longer had, and then toward the open door. Beyond it lay the prairie, blanketed in snow. And beyond, that's something Martha could never imagine. What she didn't know was that the boy she saved was the only living heir to one of the last surviving Sioux bloodlines. He had escaped a massacre, crawling through rivers and ravines, hiding from men who had betrayed their own promises, burned his people's winter camp, and slaughtered without mercy. For 3 days he had run, wounded and starving. She will shelter you, and when the time is right, she will remind. The white world, who we are, Martha had never heard those words. She only saw a boy on the edge of death. And when she fed him, she didn't just give him bread, she passed him hope. But on the 3rd day, the riders came. 3 men in brown dusters, armed and cruel, following tracks through snow with practiced eyes. They weren't lawmen, they weren't friends. They were hunters of men, of children, of anyone who stood in the way of their coin, and Martha, still starving, still alone, had unknowingly taken in the most hunted child in the Western Territories. The boy woke that morning with a look in his eyes that Martha would remember for the rest of her life. A storm was coming and she was no longer part of the wind. The sound of hooves slicing through fresh snow echoed across the frozen plains like distant war drums. 3 riders emerged from the hills by noon, their silhouettes black against the gray sky. They weren't in a rush. They had followed broken footprints for miles, and the trail had grown fresh again just before dawn. Each man wore his cruelty. In plain sight, wide hats pulled low, rifles strapped tight, and eyes that had long forgotten kindness. These weren't bounty hunters. They were mercenaries for hire sent by railroad barons and land magnates who wanted nothing left of the Sioux, not even their stories. The boy had no name Martha could pronounce, and he still hadn't spoken. But she saw how he reacted when he sensed them long before their approach. That morning, before sunrise, he sat on the cold floor and stared toward the west, toward the place where the wind carried the scent of horses and death. His fingers twitched like a man recalling a fight. And when she tried to lay a hand on his shoulder, he flinched not in fear, but readiness. She knew then that this boy had seen more war than any soldier she had ever nursed through fever. By the time she noticed the trail of smoke in the distance thin as a whisper curling into the clouds, it was too late to run. The woods offered no cover, the barn no defense, and the shack a coffin if she stayed. Still, she didn't move. Instead, Martha boiled the last scraps of potato peel in creek water and placed it before the boy. He didn't eat. He listened, and when the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of laughter low, menacing, and close, he rose from the cot. She saw him reach under the mattress where she'd hidden her dead husband's hunting knife. He held it in silence, blade small, in his hand, but sharp enough to gut a deer. She didn't ask questions. There were no questions left that mattered. Outside, the first man arrived. His horse kicked up snow and slush, and the animal's eyes were wild with cold. The man dismounted like he owned the land, strolled toward the shack with a swagger born. From bloodshed, his face was pale, beard thick with ice, and around his belt hung a string of braids, not his, not for decoration. A war trophy. Sioux heir, he called out. But no one answered. Martha stood at the window, body rigid, hands trembling. She was not a fighter. She'd never fired a gun, never raised a hand. But something deeper than fear surged inside her hand. Old instinct, the one that made mothers lift wagons off their children, the one that whispered, "Protect." The boy didn't wait. As the man neared the door, he crouched low by the hearth and gripped the knife. His breathing slowed, his eyes narrowed. He looked not like a child, but a predator, small, wounded, but deadly. The door creaked open. The rider stepped inside, then movement. Fast, silent, like a shadow leaping from firelight. The boy launched from the ground, driving the blade upward. It caught the man off guard, slashing across his coat, not deep, but enough to make him stumble. The boy didn't stop. He twisted, struck again, then again. The man roared, shoved the child back, and raised his pistol. But Martha, starving, aching, exhausted, the sound of bone cracking beneath cast iron was a dull, sickening thud. He dropped to the floor, twitching, then still. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Outside, the other 2 riders dismounted. They heard nothing. One of them smirked. "Reckon she's got him by now," he muttered. But then a coyote cried in the hills, long and mournful. Inside the shack, Martha's hands shook as she dropped the skillet. The boy looked at her not with gratitude, but with something older. Respect, shared purpose, blood-earned trust. They didn't speak. They couldn't. The second rider stepped onto the porch. The boy took the dead man's gun, clumsy in his hands. Unfamiliar, but determined. He pointed it toward the door. Martha grabbed the hatchet from the wall. No plan, no time. But something else happened. The snow turned heavier, wind cutting sideways across the yard. The third rider, the one furthest from the cabin, paused. He scanned the tree line, his eyes narrowing. Then he turned to his partner and muttered, "We ain't alone," because they weren't. Unseen by Martha and the boy, shadows moved at the edges of the woods. Silent forms cloaked in fur and ash. A half-dozen figures watched from the ridge above men, who who wore no insignia, no boots, no spurs, painted faces and bows strung tight. Riders of the wind, sons of silence. The remnants of the boy's clan, those who had survived the massacre, had followed the trail of the heir, unseen, untracked, and now. The boy had drawn blood. One of the warriors lifted his bow. The second man kicked open the shack door, and the storm unleashed. The second rider barely had time to blink as he burst through the door of the cabin. Expecting weakness and a wounded child, he found something else entirely steel and silence. And a woman who had already killed to protect what wasn't hers. The boy didn't flinch. He fired the revolver, but the bullet tore into the wall, ricocheting into the stove. Sparks rained onto the floor. Martha ducked, throwing herself to the side. The boy didn't wait for a second chance. He lunged, driving the barrel upward with both hands. The shot that followed struck the ceiling beam, but the sound was the alarm the woods had waited for. Outside, the snow muffled everything except the twang of bowstrings. 2 arrows cut through the storm like lightning. One found the third rider square in the chest. He toppled off his horse before he could draw breath. The second sank deep into the second man's thigh. He screamed, clutching the wound, trying to stumble back out of the shack. The boy watched him fall backward into the snow, then stood motionless by the doorway, gun lowered, not because he didn't know what to do next, but because he did, they wouldn't run. The warriors emerged from the trees like ghosts, painted and wind-worn, silent in every step. They surrounded the cabin without a word. Not one of them looked at Martha. They looked only at the boy. And he, though barely able to stand, stepped through the door and into the snow. The letter a man whose braids were streaked with gray and whose chest bore scars like story stepped forward. He spoke a single word in Lakota, and the boy answered, nodding once. Martha watched from the doorway, unsure if she should be afraid. The leader turned to her, eyes sharp, ancient, unyielding. She expected judgment, perhaps dismissal. Instead, he gave the slightest bow of his head. Respect, not because she had fought, but because she had fed. Then they took the bodies. Without haste, without rage, the warriors lifted the dead both. Their enemy and their fallen brother. They buried the arrowed one behind the cabin, offering prayer into the wind. As for the 2 dead raiders, they were dragged to the edge of the woods. The leader turned to Martha, said something she couldn't understand, and drew a symbol in the snow with his boot, a circle, with a line through the center. Then they vanished into the trees, the boy included. Martha stood alone again, for days. After, she sat at the table, hands folded, heart hollow. She didn't know if she'd ever see the boy again. He had vanished like a spirit, carried back to a world she'd never been part of. The bread she had shared, the fight she had joined, was anything more than a flicker against the dark. Then one morning, a sound woke her. Not hooves, not rifles, a wagon. She stepped outside and saw something impossible. Coming up the ridge was a procession of horses and carts, led by the boy now dressed in ceremonial hides, face painted, standing tall beside the scarred warrior chief. Behind them, other members of the tribe carried sacks, blankets, and bundles of food. In the last cart were tools, iron, axes, seeds. They didn't speak as they reached her doorstep. The boy stepped forward, holding something wrapped in buckskin. He handed it to her with both hands. Inside was a necklace on beaded, with a buffalo tooth now surrounded by carved stone. The chief stepped forward and pointed at the land around her. He placed his palm on her chest, then his own heart. And Martha, starved, grieving, forgotten by the world, began to cry, not from fear or joy, but from understanding. They weren't just thanking her. They were making her kin that day. They began rebuilding the homestead. The boy, still silent, helped hammer the new beams into place. The warriors cleared the ruined barn. The women taught Martha to prepare roots and wild herbs she had never touched before. For the first time in 2 years, the smoke that rose from her chimney didn't carry the scent of sorrow. It carried life. But peace in the frontier was never permanent. Far beyond the valley, news of the ambush had reached those who had funded the hunters. Men with papers and titles who believed land could be bought with bullets. They didn't care that a woman had fed a boy. They didn't care that she had bled for him. They cared that the boy had survived, and they would send more than hunters. Next time, they would send a war, and as the first thunderclouds of summer gathered over the plains, Martha knew her life would never return to what it once was, because now her redemption was tied to a child born of wind and fire, and she would defend that bond, whatever it cost. Summer thunder rolled like distant cannon fire across the plains. Low and long, a warning from the heavens. But what came next didn't wear feathers or ride bareback. It wore polished boots, navy coats, and cold metal pins of authority. The company men had arrived, not soldiers, not lawmen, worse, men with contracts, court orders, and mercenaries, masquerading as marshals. The kind of men who killed without lifting a gun because they made others do it for them. They came in a line of wagons with reinforced sides, 4 horses each, dust billowing behind like smoke from an unseen fire. At their lead sat a man named Lark, William D. Lark, a land commissioner for the Great Northern Rail Company. But his reach stretched beyond the maps. Wherever treaties were broken, wherever blood-soaked soil, Lark had walked first, smiled second, and built track third. He had lost a valuable investment when his hired guns failed to bring back the Sioux heir. Now he came to clean the slate. Martha saw them before they reached the tree line. She stood in the garden that now bloomed with life, surrounded by the green shoots planted by Sioux women. She didn't panic. She simply turned and walked back into the house, her every step measured, as if her body had been preparing for this moment since the day she buried her child. When the wagons arrived, Lark didn't speak to her directly. He sent one of his men to knock, heavy and loud. She opened the door but didn't invite him in. Instead, she stepped outside and stood on the porch, where her cracked boots met polished shoes. Lark's voice was soft but dripping with condescension. He spoke of trespassing tribes, government contracts, and violent savages. He offered her money, promises, protection. He even handed her a forged letter claiming her land was no longer hers, that it had been reallocated under new federal charter for railway expansion. Martha didn't answer him. She just looked past his shoulder, toward the hills where the wind always ran faster, where she knew they were watching. Lark noticed her silence and narrowed his eyes. "You're harboring something," he said. "Something that doesn't belong here." Still, she said nothing. But inside her palm, she held the buffalo tooth necklace. She gripped it like a prayer. By dusk, the wagons set up camp near the creek. They would not leave. Not without what they came for. But they weren't just after the land. They wanted to find the boy, rip him from the earth like a weed, and crush the symbol he had become to his people. Lark didn't fear the tribe. He feared what the boy would grow into. That night, Martha lit no fire. She sat in the dark, windows shuttered, rifle across her lapknot, out of hatred, but resolve. Outside, she heard footsteps in the grass, whispers in English, the metallic click of a hammer being drawn back. They thought she slept. They thought she'd fold. But before they reached the porch, an arrow hit the first man in the thigh. He howled, collapsing like a puppet with its strings cut. The second tried to run only to be caught in a snare that lifted him screaming into the trees. Lark's men lit lanterns and scrambled with guns drawn. But the woods swallowed the light. One by one, they fell back to camp, dragging the wounded, and looking over their shoulders at shadows that never moved. The next morning, the tribe stepped into the clearing, not in war paint, not with fury, with silence. A line of warriors stood shoulder to shoulder at the tree line. The chief stood in front, his chest bare, his arms out, no weapon in sight. Behind him, the boy, no longer trembling, no longer hiding. The boy walked, forward with the necklace around his neck and the buffalo tooth shining in the morning sun, and he raised his arm not to attack, but to be seen. Lark stared. There was no mistaking it now. The boy was alive, and more than that, he was not afraid. That was the real threat. Martha stepped forward, joining the boy, and as she did, more settlers emerged from nearby Valisquata, desperate people who had seen too much and stayed too silent for too long. Some came with nothing but their clothes, others carried rifles. They didn't come for war, they came. For truth, Lark realized Telesis wasn't just about one boy. It was about the land, the stories, the bridges that had been burned and rebuilt in silence. The bread that had been shared. His threats meant nothing now. His forged papers fluttered uselessly in the wind, and as he ordered his men to pack up, to fall back, he left with eyes hollowed by something he had never faced before. Redemption, without permission. He would return. He always did, no longer bent to men like him, because a starving woman had once shared her bread with a forgotten boy, and now the plains remembered. Weeks passed like whispered prayers in the wind quiet, full of waiting and heavy with meaning. The valley, once barren and broken, grew green with rebirth. Martha's homestead, once a tomb of grief, had become something else entirely, a gathering, place for the forgotten, the wounded, and the hopeful. The Sioux warriors came and went, building not just shelter but trust. The settlers who dared to look beyond bloodlines began to understand the truth of this land. It could only be shared, not owned, but redemption has a price, and the plains, though silent, do not forget. Lark had left, but only to return with more than ink and lies. He came back not with mercenaries, but with federal soldiers, polished and proud, with orders signed by distant hands that had never touched this soil. He claimed this was for national interest, to prevent uprising, to protect future development. But his eyes told a different truth. He had been humiliated, and men like Lark never forget being defied by the poor. The soldiers set up posts near the ridge. Not once did they step into Martha's yard without permission, but their presence hung over the land like thunderclouds. The boy, now known among his people as Tahuviaka, Buffalo Feather, watched them daily from the tree line. He was no longer the starving child she had found. He had grown broader in the shoulders, stronger in spirit, his silence now commanding. Instead of haunted the tribe met in secret. They knew what was coming. The government didn't want war, but it also didn't want symbols it couldn't control. Tahuviaka had become more than a boy, he was a legend in the making. His story had begun to travel with the wind, a child fed by a settler woman, protected by a forgotten people, and raised among two worlds. The elders spoke of sending him away to Canada, perhaps, or deeper into the mountains. But Martha disagreed. She stood in the center of the gathering lodge, thin but unshaking, and spoke words they never expected to hear from white lips. He belongs here, and I'll stand. With him, they didn't answer right away. But later that night, they lit sacred fires, and a vote was cast not with paper, but with feathers, stones, and tokens of blood. The next morning, the first shots were fired, not by the tribe, by nervous soldiers startled by shadows. One of them struck an elder gathering herbs by the creek. The bullet tore through his chest before he even had time to turn. He died with his hands open empty. Word spread fast. Tahuviaka stood over the elder's body with eyes full of calm fire. He did not cry, he did not rage. He simply looked to the west, where the soldiers camped beneath fluttering flags, and then he turned, walked back to Martha's cabin, and took the rifle from above the hearth. Martha said nothing as he passed her. She only placed her hand on his shoulder and nodded. That evening, the tribe did not ride to war, but they moved with purpose. Silent, deliberate, they took up positions along the ridges, not to ambush, but to be seen, to show they would not vanish again. And something unexpected happened. The settlers began to arrive. Men and women who had once feared the Sioux now stood beside them, carrying pitchforks, old muskets, and farming tools. They didn't come to fight, they came to witness, to say, "We see you," and in a place where history had always been written by the loudest gun, their presence whispered something louder. By nightfall, the soldiers were surrounded not by warriors but by farmers, mothers, children, and outlaws turned allies. Lark stood in the center of it all, his fury wrapped in politeness. He threatened arrests. He cited laws. He waved papers, but the land did not care. For his voice, it remembered only the bread and the boy and the woman who chose hunger so another could live that night. As the moon carved light across the valley, the soldiers packed up their camp without a word. The general in charge, old man with tired eyes, left a single note behind it said, "This is not our fight. Let the land judge its own." Lark didn't sleep that night because he knew he had lost not to weapons but to memory. The valley knew peace again, not the kind found in treaties or silence, but the kind that settles only when justice has taken root. For the first time in decades, both Sioux and settler worked side by side, not under orders, but by choice. There were no celebrations, no grand declarations, just quiet rebuilding, shared harvests, smoke from shared fires rising into a sky that no longer felt divided. And in the middle of it all stood Martha's homestead, but it was no longer hers alone. What began as a broken shack patched with rusted tin had become a lodge of cedar and stone. The porch where she once stood alone with a skillet in her hand now held children listening to stories. Some had braids, some had sun hats, but all of them listened because they knew this place was sacred ground not for what had been built, but for what had been given. Tahuviaka Buffalo Feather was no longer a boy. He had grown tall, lean like the prairie grass, with eyes that held the storms of both worlds. His people had offered him the chance to lead, to carry the bloodline of his ancestors as their voice in a world that had forgotten them, but he asked for something else. He asked to stay, to build something that didn't belong to the past or the future, but to both and Martha. She was never the same woman again. The hunger that once hollowed her had become something fuller, richer. She tended not only crops, but people. When new settlers arrived, exhausted, wounded by greed and false promises, she took them in, not with pity, but with the quiet strength of someone who had buried a child, outlived sorrow, and risen with nothing but bread and a heartbeat. Years passed. The railroad never cut through the valley. Lark vanished into political shadows, his name lost among failed projects and lawsuits. But in every nearby town, people told the story how the woman who shared her bread with a boy changed the course of a county. And one day, something remarkable happened to Boy Now. A man returned to the tree where Martha's husband had been buried. He knelt in silence, then stood and pressed a painted handprint onto the wooden cross. That same day, he gathered the village and elders and revealed what he had been building in secret with local blacksmiths and Sioux craftspeople. It was a plaque heavy, carved from stone and metal, set into a new wall near the lodge. It read, "On this land, a woman gave bread instead of fear, and the world became different because of it." Below, etched in both Lakota and English, were the names of the fallen, the survivors, and one line that stood alone. This is where redemption began. The sun that day fell slower than usual, as if the sky, too, wanted to linger. Gold poured across the fields, touching every leaf, every stone. Martha stood at the top of the hill, wrapped in a shawl woven by the women of the tribe. Her hair had gone silver, her hands were thin, but her spirit stood straighter than ever. Beside her stood the man she had once fed, no longer a child, no longer starving. They didn't speak, they didn't need to, because sometimes history isn't written in ink, it's written in footprints. Through snow, in broken bread, in shared silence. And in a cabin that once held nothing but ashes rebuilt, now in the memory of gold and in the heart of the frontier, long forgotten by maps and governments, redemption endured. Not because it was earned, but because someone gave it away, free land, it bloomed.